I want to continue our discussion of African Americans in the Gilded Age, and I want to talk in a brief lecture now about blacks in World War I. World War I was a watershed moment for African Americans. Now, there was a serious labor shortage during World War I. The outbreak of war strengthened the market power of workers because they were such in demand. There were several reasons that caused this. War orders from Europe for guns and other things prompted manufacturers to expand their production facilities and workforces. Meanwhile, the number of European immigrants, which had always been driving American industry, plummeted from more than 1 million in 1914 to about 200,000 in 1915, just 31,000 in 1918. The course of the war prevented Europeans from coming to America. And so the U.S. industry lost about 3 million workers during that period. It would have had otherwise. It lost another 5 million workers, American men, to military service. The U.S. assembled a massive army to send over to France in 1917 and 1918. So what did they do? Manufacturers responded to the shortage by encouraging potential workers around the country to come to their factories in the North. From the rural South, 500,000 African Americans migrated to the industrial centers of New York, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and St. Louis between 1916 and 1920. They had come before, but this was such massive numbers, it's referred to as the Great Migration. By the way, another 500,000 white Southerners followed the same path during that period. This painting here, The Migration of the Negro, is a very famous painting by Jacob Lawrence, which commemorates this incredible shifting of people from south to north and beginning to establish major pockets of African Americans in these northern cities. African Americans couldn't always get the best jobs in these cities, but they would take what they could get. It was usually an improvement over life in the South. A number of women took jobs that normally would have gone to men because of this labor shortage, and a lot of African American women applied to get the jobs they vacated. Here's a letter written from several African American women from Florida to a paper called the Chicago Defender. It was a leading black newspaper in Chicago, and they're seeking assistance to join the Great Migration. The letter says, "Kind sir, we have several times read your noted paper, and we are delighted with the same because it is a thorough Negro paper. There is a storm of our people toward the north, and especially to your city. We have watched your want ads regularly, and we are anxious for location with good families where we can be cared for and do domestic work. We want to engage as cook, nurse, and maid. We've had some educational advantages, as we have taught in rural schools for a few years, but our pay is so poor we could not continue. We furnish testimonial of our honesty and integrity and moral standing. Will you please assist us in securing places, as we are anxious to come but want jobs before we leave. We want to do any kind of honest labor. Our chance here is so poor." That letter is a nice summary of the drivers of the Great Migration. Now, when Woodrow Wilson addressed Congress and made his case for the declaration of war, he very famously said, "We need to make the world safe for democracy." And this phrase became an important catchphrase. We see here he's a soldier. He is keeping the world safe for democracy. Enlist and help him. This kind of backfired. We'll talk more about it later. But black people specifically, but also other immigrants thought, hey, this is great. We're going to make the world safe for democracy. Maybe we can get some for ourselves as well. So paradoxically, the white supremacist Wilson's ideals about democracy encouraged a thirst for democracy, especially among African Americans in America. Now, to raise this massive army, the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force that it was going to send to France, Wilson decided that volunteering was great, and we would encourage people to do that, but we also needed conscription, the draft, something that had not been done since the Civil War. Almost 400,000 African American men served, representing approximately 10% of the force, about the same percentage as African Americans in the total population at the time. Many more would have served had Southern draft boards permitted them to register, and had the Marines and other service branches been willing to accept African Americans in their ranks. Now, As you know, Wilson oversaw the segregation of the federal government for the first time. This also applied to the armed forces. Rather than integrate the armed forces, they segregated black soldiers from white. Virtually all the African Americans were assigned to all black units and barred from combat. Being stripped of combat was particularly galling to blacks who in previous wars had proven themselves to be among the best American fighters. There was a group called the Buffalo Soldiers, which had distinguished themselves in the West, and again the Spanish-American War. General John Pershing, who led the AEF, was fully aware of the African-American contribution. He himself had commanded African-American troops in the 10th Cavalry, which was an all-black regiment that distinguished itself in Cuba. Pershing's military reputation had depended so heavily on black troops who fought for him that he had acquired the nickname Black Jack Pershing. So he was very familiar with these troops, and it galled him that he couldn't put them in combat. He was pressured by groups like the NAACP to put them in combat. But you're probably wondering, why do these black guys want to fight? Well, because it will give them distinction, and it will give them some capital with which they can expect to get more respect and more rights when they return home. One of the most decorated AEF units was New York's 369th Regiment, a black unit recruited in Harlem. And because the NAACP and other rights groups pressured Pershing to allow these troops to fight, he couldn't do it given the rules in the United States Army, but he offered the 369th to the French Army. They didn't care. A lot of their troops were black. In fact, curiously, these black troops are fighting alongside colonial black troops from British and French empires. And so he lends the 369th to the French, and they served incredibly well. They served in forward Allied trenches for 191 days, longer than any other U.S. regiment, and scored one major success after another. In gratitude for its service, the French government decorated the entire unit with one of its highest honors, the Croix de Guerre, the Cross of War, extremely high honor, and you can see that every one of these soldiers is wearing one. So blacks did distinguish themselves, but unfortunately it will not buy them much at home. More about that later.